as you find every day in the papers?"
"No,"
was her eager answer.
"Is it not like them all?"
"Read," was my quiet interruption. "On this day at the Colonnade." "On what day? The date is usually given in all the bona fide notices I have seen."
"Is it?"
she asked, her eyes moist with unshed tears, opening widely in her astonishment. "Look in the papers on your return home and see. Then the print. Observe that the type is identical on both sides of this make-believe clipping, which in fact there is always a perceptible difference between that used in the obituary column and that to be found in the columns devoted to other matter. Notice also," I continued, holding up the scrap of paper between her and the light, "that the alignment on one side is not exactly parallel with that on the other, a discrepancy which would not exist if both sides had been printed on a newspaper press. These facts lead me to conclude, first, that the effort to match the type exactly was the mistake of a man who tries to do too much, and secondly, that one of the sides at least, presumably that containing the obituary notice, was printed on a hand press, on the blank side of a piece of galley proof picked up in some newspaper office."
"Let me see."
And stretching out her hand with the utmost eagerness, she took the slip and turned it over. Instantly a change took place in her countenance. She sank back in her seat, and a blush of manifest confusion suffused her cheeks.
"Oh!"
she exclaimed.
"What will you think of me? I brought this scrap of print into the house myself, and it was I who pinned it on the cushion with my own hands. I remember it now. The sight of those words recalls the whole occurrence."
"Then there is one mystery less for us to solve," I remarked, somewhat dryly.
"Do you think so?"
she protested, with a deprecatory look.
"For me the mystery deepens, and becomes every minute more serious. It is true that I brought this scrap of newspaper into the house, and that it had, then as now, the notice of my husband's death upon it. But the time of my bringing it in was Tuesday night, and he was not found dead till Wednesday morning."
"A discrepancy worth noting," I remarked.
"Involving a mystery of some importance,"
she concluded. I agreed to that. "And since we have discovered how the slip came into your room, we can now proceed to the clearing up of this mystery," I observed. "You can, of course, inform me where you procured this clipping, which you say you brought into the house?"
"Yes. You may think it strange, but when I alighted from the carriage that night, a man on the sidewalk put this tiny scrap of paper into my hand. It was done so mechanically that it made no more impression on my mind than the thrusting of an advertisement upon me. Indeed, I supposed it was an advertisement, and I only wonder that I retained it in my hand at all. But that I did so, and that in a moment of abstraction I went so far as to pin it to my cushion, is evident from the fact that a vague memory remains in my mind of having read this recipe which you see printed on the reverse side of the paper."
"It was the recipe, then, and not the obituary notice that attracted your attention the night before?"
"Probably, but in pinning it to the cushion, it was the obituary notice that chanced to come uppermost. Oh, why should I not have remembered this till now? Can you understand my forgetting a matter of so much importance?"
"Yes," I allowed, after a momentary consideration of her ingenuous countenance. "The words you read in the morning were so startling that they disconnected themselves from those you had carelessly glanced at the night before."
"That is it," she replied. "And since then I have had eyes for the one side only. How could I think of the other? But who could have printed this thing, and who was the man who put it into my hand? He looked like a beggar, but oh!" she suddenly exclaimed, her cheeks flushing scarlet, and her eyes flashing with a feverish, almost alarming glitter. "What is it now?" I asked. "Another recollection?" "Yes."
She spoke so low I could hardly hear her.
"He coughed and—"
"And what?" I encouragingly suggested, seeing that she was under some new and overwhelming emotion.
"That cough had a familiar sound, now that I think of it. It was like that of a friend But no, no, I will not wrong him by any false surmises. He would stoop to much, but not to that. Yet—"
The flush on her cheeks had died away, but the two vivid spots which remained showed the depth of her excitement.
"Do you think," she
suddenly asked,
"that a man out of revenge might plan to frighten me by a false notice of my husband's death, and that God, to punish him, made the notice a prophecy?"
"I think a man influenced by the spirit of revenge might do almost anything," I answered, purposely ignoring the latter part of her question.
"But I always considered him a good man. At least I never looked upon him as a wicked one. Every other beggar we meet has a cough, and yet,"
she added after a moment's pause,
"if it was not he who gave me this mortal shock, who was it? He is the only person in the world I ever wronged."
"Had you not better tell me his name?" I suggested.
"No, I am in too great doubt. I should hate to do him a second injury."
"You cannot injure him if he is innocent. My methods are very safe."
"If I could forget his cough! But it had that peculiar catch in it that I remembered so well in the cough of John Graham. I did not pay any especial heed to it at the time. Old days and old troubles were far enough from my thoughts. But now that my suspicions are raised, that low choking sound comes back to me in a strangely persistent way, and I seem to see a well-remembered form in the stooping figure of this beggar. Oh, I hope the good God will forgive me if I attribute to this disappointed man a wickedness he never committed."
"Who is John Graham?" I urged, "and what was the nature of the wrong you did him?" She rose, cast me one appealing glance, and perceiving that I meant to have her whole story, turned towards the fire and stood warming her feet before the hearth, with her face turned away from my gaze.
"I was once engaged to marry him," she began. "Not because I loved him, but because we were very poor. I mean my mother and myself. And he had a home and seemed both good and generous. The day came when we were to be married. This was in the West, way out in Kansas. And I was even dressed for the wedding, when a letter came from my uncle here, a rich uncle, very rich, who had never had anything to do with my mother since her marriage. And in it he promised me fortune and everything else desirable in life, if I would come to him, unencumbered by any foolish ties. Think of it! And I within half an hour of marriage with a man I had never loved, and now suddenly hated. The temptation was overwhelming, and, heartless as my conduct may appear to you, I succumbed to it. Telling my lover that I had changed my mind, I dismissed the minister when he came, and announced my intention of proceeding east as soon as possible. Mr. Graham was simply paralyzed by his disappointment, and during the few days which intervened before my departure, I was haunted by his face, which was like that of a man who had died from some overwhelming shock. But when I was once free of the town, especially after I arrived in New York, I forgot alike his misery and himself. Everything I saw was so beautiful, life was so full of charm, and my uncle so delighted with me and everything I did. Then there was James Holmes, and after I had seen him, but I cannot talk of that. We loved each other, and under the surprise of this new delight, how could I be expected to remember the man I had left behind me in that barren region in which I had spent my youth? But he did not forget the misery I had caused him. He followed me to New York, and on the morning I was married found his way into the house, and mixing with the wedding guests, suddenly appeared before me just as I was receiving the congratulations of my friends. At sight of him I experienced all the terror he had calculated upon causing, but remembering at whose side I stood, I managed to hide my confusion under an aspect of apparent haughtiness. This irritated John Graham. Flushing with anger and ignoring my imploring look, he cried peremptorily, "Present me to your husband!" And I felt forced to present him. But his name produced no effect upon Mr. Holmes. I had never told him of my early experience with this man, and John Graham, perceiving this, cast me a bitter glance of disdain and passed on, muttering between his teeth, false to me and false to him. Your